In the 1800s, Chinese immigrants were flocking to America. They were traveling over the Pacific Ocean and arriving on the coast of California. Chinese immigration is often separated into three distinct time periods: 1849 to 1882, 1882 to 1965, and 1965 to present day.
The first period, the only period we'll be talking about in this documentary, starts with the California Gold Rush that started in 1849 and ends abruptly with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Remember this act as we will be talking about it later in this video.
In the mid-1800s, most Chinese immigrants came to America because they were very poor and faced economic hardships in China. They would come to America in hopes of finding a good job where they could make some money and send most of their earnings they made back to their poor families in China. In many cases, families would send the dad or husband to go and be a merchant in the States so that he could earn enough money to support his family back in China.
After only a couple years, tens of thousands of immigrants had already arrived, and vast numbers were making the decision to come to America. This immigration was having an impact on Americans' ability to get good jobs, and people who had already been living in the United States for a long time started to feel as if the Chinese immigrants were stealing their jobs.
This combination of events is what led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act and how it came to be is very similar to the way many feel about Mexicans crossing the United States southern border.
In 1882, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a law that banned Chinese people from immigrating to the United States.
In fact, it is the only law in United States history that made it illegal for a certain race to enter the country.
There were some small cases in which some Chinese were let through as merchants during this period, but the only way you could come through is if you could prove you had a family member that was a citizen.
Starting in the mid-19th century, the United States saw wave after wave of immigrants looking for work and better opportunities in America, and a large portion of these immigrants came from China. Millions of Chinese people were starving as a result of a huge famine that devastated China, and these people were looking for any and every way to survive. Meanwhile, the United States was in the middle of the gold rush, and the appeal of striking it rich was just too much for these Chinese to turn down. Although some of these immigrants did work mining gold, many others found jobs in the agricultural field, no pun intended, and in cheap factory labor. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad also provided many jobs for Chinese laborers, and by 1870, Chinese made up 25% of the labor force in California, which is quite a bit. At first, Chinese immigrants were tolerated by Americans, but soon California saw decreasing amounts of gold, which led to competition among lower-class workers and the Chinese. Both economic and cultural tensions were on the rise, and in 1877, anti-Chinese riots broke out in San Francisco. Pressure grew to pass a bill banning Chinese immigration, but President Chester Arthur vetoed it because he thought it violated the terms of the 1868 Berlin Game Treaty with China, which guaranteed Chinese the right to immigration, but not necessarily the right to naturalization. Finally, in 1882, President Chester Arthur passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which suspended the entry of Chinese immigrants for 10 years but didn't ban it. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first significant law that restricted immigration to the United States. One critic of the act was a Republican senator of Massachusetts, George Frisbee Hoar. He was an abolitionist and an anti-imperialist, and he described the act as nothing less than the legalization of racial discrimination. Supporters of the act included labor unions like the Knights of Labor. They believed industrialists used Chinese laborers as a wedge to keep wages low. Democrats, led by supporters in the West, advocated for the exclusion of Chinese immigrants, and they saw the passing of the act as a victory. In 1888, Congress took the act a step further and passed the Scott Act, which prohibited re-entry into the United States after a visit to China. And in 1902, Congress passed the Geary Act, which extended the exclusion for 10 more years, as well as expanding the borders of the law to Hawaii and the Philippines. The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't officially repealed until 1943, and only because China was a strong ally against Japan in World War II. Yeah, not our finest moment. So that was the Chinese Exclusion Act in about 3 minutes. We hope this helps you understand it just a little bit better.
In 1892, the Geary Act was put into place, forcing any Chinese immigrant in the United States to carry documentation such as a birth certificate with them at all times.
This leads me and Aries to who the Chinese paper sons really were. Once the Chinese Exclusion Act was put into place in 1882, the Chinese started finding other alternative ways to get into the States.
Though it worked, these methods were very illegal at the time. Because birth certificates were required for you to get in, many people paid a high amount of money to be given the birth certificates of others, so they could enter the States with other families.
This is why they were given the nickname of the paper sons or paper daughters, because they were using faulty paperwork.
Once they bought or persuaded others into giving them the papers and the plan was set into place, the paper sons often started studying the certificates and the families so they could properly answer questions once inspection time came.
Because some families spoke with different dialect, some paper sons had to even adapt to new ways of speech and socialization.
When the paper sons or daughters came to America from China, they would usually arrive at one of the biggest centers of immigration coming from East Asia, Angel Island, California.
Angel Island was a small island near the San Francisco Bay. This island is a little over a square mile and is 6.5 miles from San Francisco. The island opened its immigration station in 1910.
Angel Island is a huge part of Asian immigration into the United States because over 1 million Asians were processed through the station. Over 175,000 immigrated from China and over 117,000 came from Japan.
The process of going through Angel Island was long with very precise guidelines, and some didn't even end up getting through.
Ellis Island, over on the East Coast, which mostly processed European immigrants, had a rejection rate of only 1 to 3%.
But at Angel Island, that number was much higher, at 18%, making about 1 out of 5 immigrants not being allowed in.
To apply, you had to be of at least 21 years of age, but for women and merchants, age didn't matter.
Because of the language barrier, inspectors also had translators with them. One translator would translate for the father, one for the wife, and one for the child. The inspectors would take notes on things like resemblance and if the family spoke with the same dialect.
Being a paper son or daughter was very risky and in lots of cases ended up with the immigrant being sent back to China. This was because you had to pretend to be a whole different person and sometimes you even had to look like them.
In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed all public records, including every document about Chinese immigrants.
This made it very easy to pretend they were another person's family member because there were no documents to prove that they weren't.
Without the San Francisco earthquake and fire, it would have made it much harder to get in.
It all seems like so much stress and work, so why would the paper sons be putting themselves through all of that?
Job opportunities were getting scarce, and they knew that people in the States would definitely hire them. Many of the Asian immigrants were being placed in working positions with very low wages and being given poor living conditions.
Most Asian immigrants took the jobs because they were the best they could get and were still much better than the jobs back in China. Many Asian immigrants also came to America in hopes to provide a better future for their own children.
The jobs the Chinese were placed in varied, mostly in railroad work in the West. Chinese immigrants were a huge part of the Central Pacific Railroad.
In fact, over 90% of workers who helped build the Central Pacific Railroad were Asian immigrants. Without the immigrants, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad would have took months or even years longer than it did.
In conclusion, the Chinese paper sons were a huge part of Chinese immigration into the States.
Even today, many Chinese Americans have family members that aren't even related to them because of paper sons who kept their fake name their entire life.
Chinese paper sons were very determined, and even though they did break the law, most of the time they did it for their families.
I think this era of illegal Chinese immigration through forged paperwork is similar to the times happening in the U.S. today because of similar situations happening with illegal Mexican immigrants. The conflict in our topic is that the Chinese immigrants were banned from entering the United States. The compromise of our topic is that the Chinese immigrants were allowed in if they could prove they had family in the United States that had proper citizenship. Chinese paper sons did what they did to get a better life and help their families.
Hopefully we can learn from our mistake that we made with the Chinese Exclusion Act and never ban a certain race from entering our great country again.
Thank you for taking the time to watch our documentary.
We hope you liked it.
Bye!